Hi everyone, Dara O'Kearney here. This is the first in a series of videos I want to make on how to study like a pro. Pros typically study in a certain way using software tools to analyze spots and situations. In this video I'm going to introduce a piece of software called PioSolver, which is probably the most widely used post-flop solver. And I was an early adopter of PioSolver when it came out 6 or 7 years ago, whatever it was. And I've been using it constantly ever since. The way I study with it has evolved over the years. I think in the beginning I made a lot of the common mistakes that people made, which hopefully if you follow my videos you will not make, and it'll save you time that way. But I also think that the approach I adopted wasn't optimal. I think the approach almost everybody started with when the post-flop solvers came was, they would play a hand live, they would wonder whether they'd done the right thing, they'd go home, they'd run in inverted commas the solve, and then they would hopefully they were hoping to see that the solver would say that the way they played the hand was okay, but if not, they would try and identify what the errors were so that they could improve in future. Now that's useful, obviously, but unless the exact same situation ever arises again, not that useful. It's far more useful to sort of look at more general spots and to consider how you play your entire range rather than the exact hand you had. That said, I'm going to start just to introduce PO with a situation where I played a hand in the World Series main event that I wasn't sure about, and as a result I ran the solve. So let's start with the hand. This hand was early on day 2. Now I got there late because of travel restrictions, so I didn't play day 1. I essentially entered at the start of day 2. So I flopped a set early on, picked up some chips, which is why my chip stack is above the 60k starting. So at this point, blinds were 400, 800, and I had roughly 100 big blinds. So this is the hand. The hand started with a player I've described as an aggro German, a very good pro. I think primarily a cash game player, opened in early position. He was playing very loose, and he had a big stack. Folded to me on the button with 6-4 suited, and I call, and the big blind calls as well. Now, we'll pause it there for a minute just to talk. I actually made a mistake pre-flop in that I didn't notice that the under the gun had opened. So when it came around to me on the button, I thought I was raising 6-4 suited, which would be perfectly normal. I put out the chips to raise, and then I found out I was only calling. It doesn't actually make much difference because 6-4 suited is a hand I can call at least with some frequency pre-flop. Whether I would have done this against a very strong opponent, I don't know. I might have, I might not have, but we'll see later when we get onto the ranges that it's not the end of the world that I made this mistake. So the big blind calls as well. I've described him as Old Man Coffee. He was basically an older recreational player playing fairly straightforward. The flop obviously came very favourable, 5-3-2 for me, so I flopped the nuts straight, and I also have a backdoor flush draw. Big blind checks. The aggro German bet on the large side, which actually surprised me. He bet close to 3/4 pot. I didn't think he should really be betting too much on this board. This is not a board which really favours him 5-3-2. I have all the sets, obviously. He has all the overpairs, etc. But on this board, I have all the sets. I do have 6-4 as well, as in this case, 6-4 suited at least. The big blind also he has to worry about, has all his hands. So this is not a board where he has range advantage. So I was somewhat surprised to see him bet at it. But I guess it kind of makes sense because I also have to worry about the big blind. So because it's 3-way, he can probably get me to fold a few more hands than if it was heads up. Because of the fact I have to worry about the big blind having hit this board and potentially check raising. However, obviously with the nuts I have a very simple decision. I think this is very clear. I can't imagine this is ever a raise. It's a big bet, so we don't need to raise to get a lot of money into the pot. We want to encourage him to keep bluffing if he's bluffing, and we also potentially want to encourage the big blind to come along too. This is a hand that doesn't really need much protection at all. So I think the call here is perfectly standard. So that's what I did. I called. The big blind folded, so heads up to the turn. The turn was the king of spades, Now, obviously this card favors his range more than mine, I felt. He has more kings. That said, I was kind of surprised he bet again, because after I've called the flop, I clearly have something. So he bet again on the big side, roughly 2/3 pot, and I called. I didn't see a real reason to raise for much the same reasons on the flop. I thought, if he's bluffing, let's keep him firing at this. If I raise, I'll just fold out all his bluffs. He'll need a very strong hand to continue, whereas if I just call, I keep his range nice and wide going to the river. The river came card, which doesn't really change anything, the 10 of diamonds. After a considerable thought, he checked, and I now had to decide what size to bet. In the end, I decided to go for roughly 40% of pot. I thought from a theoretical point of view, I'm supposed to go large here, probably all in, and polarize myself, because I either have a very strong hand, like I have, or I have a weak hand. For example, if I had, say, pocket fours, which I've called because it's open-ended the whole way, but I don't think it's winning. Now, I could potentially turn it into a bluff. So I think from a theoretical point of view, I'm probably supposed to polarize, but I didn't want to do that in this case, because I thought, well, I figured he almost never has a hand which will call a shove. He probably, best case scenario, he has something like jacks or queens, which might check call a small bet, or he has a king, which is also going for check call. Now, if he has a king, I can probably get away with going bigger, but I felt on balance most of his range, a lot more of his range will call a small bet. So that's why I went small, even though I felt it wasn't theoretically correct. I also thought there was some chance that he would see this as me going for thin value, maybe with a hand like king queen, say king queen of diamonds, which calls the flop because it's 2 overs and a backdoor flush draw, and then hits the king on the turn, calls again, and then goes for thin value on the river, and that might induce him to do a sort of a bluff raise to put me all in, see if I want to call off early in my WSOP main event with top pair, not top kicker. So that's why I bet smaller. He did think for a long time, and he eventually folded, so I guess he had nothing. When I talked this hand over with friends afterwards, mostly they focused on the turn, and a few of them felt that they thought I should raise the turn, which surprised me. So that encouraged me to put this hand into PO. So, okay, so this is PO. In PO, you basically have to set up all the parameters initially. Now, one point worth noting is that PO only handles heads up pots. So technically there should only be 2 players in the pot. I decided I could run this anyway, since the big blind played really no role in the pot. He folded the flop. And I think the ranges were roughly similar to what they would have been heads up anyway. So I started with impositions range. That's me on the button. And I have this sort of range here. I have essentially a kind of a condensed range. I'm missing the stuff at the top that I would 3-bet. You know, if I have aces or kings, I'm 3-betting for sure. Ace king suited. If I have stronger hands like queens or ace king off, I'm also going to 3-bet some of the time, but I'll also flat some of the time. And that's why, you know, queens is in here 0.45, which means 45% of the time it's here. I'm flatting, and I'm presumably raising the rest of the time. This is a GTO range I got from Range Trainer Pro for this situation. Similarly, ace king off, that's going to be sometimes be flatted, sometimes raised. As you get down towards the lower pairs, we're just always flatting. Hands like 6-4 suited, they're in the range 65% of the time, which means we're folding the other 35%. We can't call all the time with these types of hands, or we'll just have too much junk in our range. But typically that's what our range looks something like. And this is how you set up a spot in PO. You set up the range in this way. You can also save the ranges, so that if you want to run a similar spot in the future, you can just retrieve the range, and you'll see I have a lot of saved ranges for different stack depths and positions. So out of position is the big is the under the gun raiser. So he's obviously opening all the top of his range. He has a strong linear range. He's not opening junk just for the sake of it. He's opening strong hands, and as the hands get weaker, he's not opening them all the time. Pocket fours should be there 45% of the time, pocket threes 30%, etc. So he has this sort of range. Once we set up the two ranges, the next thing we do is we set up the board. So that's easy enough. 5 of hearts, 3 of clubs, 2 of diamonds. Then we put up the starting pot. Now you can enter this in the actual chips that we use. What I tend to do is I always just set it to big blind 10. And the reason I do that is so that when I'm looking at the output later, I can determine whether exactly how big a bet is. So if I see a bet of, say, 45 on the turn, I know that's 4.5 big blinds. I don't have to refer back to what the blinds were. If I see a shove for 312 on the river, I know that's 31.2 big blinds, etc. So the starting pot was 7.2 big blinds, and the effective stack, I'm the covered player. I put in 2 big blinds pre-flop, and I have about 78 behind, so the effective stack is 780. The next thing we have to do is we have to set up all the bet sizes that we want to consider. Now, the most important thing to do here is well, there's 2 things. First of all, you want to give a number of options on different streets. Because if you just give one bet size option, that's not really a solution to the hand. That's a solution to these are the only bet sizes you can use. So typically, for example, on the river, I gave myself a fairly small bet, 40%, which is actually the size I used. 80% bigger bet, 120 over bet, and 200 very big over bet. And you can see that on the other streets, I've given 2 or 3 options for everybody too. The second point is you want to obviously put in the sizes that were actually used. My opponent bet 75% on the flop. So I've given out of position a 75% and also a 25 if you wanted to bet small. I've given 3 different turn sizes: small, large, and over bet. It's important to realize that if you don't put in enough options on later streets, that'll affect earlier streets. For example, if you don't have overbet as an option on the turn, there are a lot of sims where the optimal strategy will be to maybe bet small on the flop and then to overbet the turn if we're called. Now, if you don't have overbet the turn as an option, then the solver will often switch to betting larger on the flop so that it can get more chips in, because it's not allowed to overbet on the turn. So to make sure it's getting enough of the stack in by the river, it will actually use a bigger size on the flop than is strictly optimal. So it's very important to understand that the sizes you give on later streets also bleed back to the earlier streets and allow you to get closer to the optimal strategy. Yeah, so I set up all of that stuff. The only other thing worth noting then is the accuracy. The lower the accuracy, if we try to solve this to 0.001% of the pot, it might run, but it could take a week. Having run a lot of sims, I've found that 0.35% is ample. The strategy very rarely changes past this point. By the time you're down to 0.35% accuracy, you're pretty much on the money as far as what the solution looks like. So that's what I always use, and that's what I recommend you guys use. Okay, so having set it up, and you basically click build tree. Sometimes if the ranges are very wide, the stacks are very deep, and you put in a lot of options, it will overflow. You won't have enough memory, and it'll give you an error message. In that case, you don't really want to change the ranges. The ranges are the ranges, and you obviously have no control over the effective stack size. But you might have to play around with taking out a few of the options that you put in on different streets. Sometimes there are situations where there's no leading on the flop, for example, and you can just take out all the leads. So if we remove those 2 options on the flop, we would effectively reduce the game tree by half and the amount of memory required by 50%. If you have to take stuff out on later streets, the way I generally work is take out the donks. They're a relatively obscure part of the game tree. They only arise if the flop goes check, check, and out of position then wants to lead the turn or the river. And you can reduce some of the sizes, maybe only have 2 sizes on later streets, but you want to have as many sizes as you possibly can for the reasons I gave earlier, just for the solve to be as accurate as possible. So I ran the solve already. You can see we solved down to 0.1%, and what I generally do before I actually look at the solve is I just look at the ranges, and if we click on this button, out of position, we'll see the range of the out of position player. This is the under the gun guy. So these are all the hands that he would open pre-flop. And and this is the equity that he has. That's the in position range. Returning to out of positions range, this number here, 54.4%, that means he has 54.4% equity on this flop. If no more money were to go into the pot, and we always went to showdown with this range against in positions range, out of position would win 54.4% of the time, and in position would win the other 45.6%. That's useful just to sort of tell at a glance who has a range advantage. So you can see that out of position has a slight range advantage here, 54 to 46 roughly. If we look at the actual range, the numbers on each combo is the actual equity of that combo. So for example, if he has aces on this board, and again, it goes to showdown, no more money goes into the pot, he's going to win 82.9% of the time. If he has pocket twos, he's going to win 85.5% of the time. If he has Jack 10 suited, he's only going to win 28% of the time. Pio does something very useful in this, in that it color codes all of the combos. So green means very strong, more than 70% equity. So those are the very strong sort of nutty hands. You can see the over pairs down as far as jacks are all over 70%. Ace 4 suited is obviously a monster on this board, and also the sets, 5s, 3s and 2s. Then the yellow hands are marginal. They're sort of, they're going to win a significant amount of the time, but they're not super strong to the point that we want to shovel a lot of money into the pot. Typically with the yellow hands, we just kind of want to get to showdown without making the pot too big. So you can see that even a hand like ace king suited is pretty strong on this board. It's got 2 overs. In 3 out of 4 cases, it's got a backdoor flush draw as well, and it has a gut shot. So that actually has pretty good equity on this 59%. All the overpairs obviously have good equity as well, but they're not super strong. And then the other color used, red or whatever color that is, those are the weaker hands in the range. The hands that probably won't win at showdown unless they improve along the way, and they have different levels of improvability. So you can sort of tell at a glance how the ranges stack up. Out of position here has some strong hands, all the green stuff, a lot of yellow hands, and a decent amount of weaker hands as well. If we compare that to in position, you can see in position actually has, down in this quadrant, a lot of really strong hands. 2 pair that under the gun doesn't have, the straight that under the gun doesn't have, all the sets which under the gun does have, ace 4 suited, but doesn't have the top pairs, doesn't have aces or kings, and only has queens some of the time. So the stronger hands are concentrated down here. There's also a lot of yellow hands, and there's a lot of complete whiffs. There's all this stuff here, this suited stuff here, which is just kind of whiffed completely. It's got 2 overs and in 3 out of 4 cases a backdoor flush draw, but right now they're very weak hands. And obviously the king X, the unsuited king X and queen X is also weak as well. You can look at the EV of the thing. Equity is how often we'll win if it goes to showdown unimproved. Or sorry, not unimproved, but over every possible run out. The EV is how much we can expect to make with each hand. So if we have pocket eights, for example, pocket aces, we can expect to make 8.25 big blinds. Now notice that it's possible for the EV to be strong, to be more than the current pot. The pot at the moment is only 7.2 big blinds, and we're saying when we have aces we'll win over 8 big blinds on average. Why is that? Well, more money will go into the pot a lot of the time, and we'll win that money too most of the time. Similarly, when we have ace 4 suited, we're winning actually twice the current pot. So you can see that the really strong hands in our range actually win more than their fair share. Aces only has equity of slightly over 80%, but it has EV of much more than 80% of the pot. 80% of the pot would be about 5.7 big blinds, but actually the EV is 8.2 big blinds. So the strong hands do really well, and that's referred to as over-realizing their equity. But conversely, some of the weak hands do really badly. And even some of the marginal hands. You can see, for example, like all of these hands are marginal in the sense that they have good equity. They're going to win half the time roughly, or in some cases more than half the time if it goes to showdown and improved. But when we look at their EV is a lot less than half the pot, because they'll be bet off the pot a lot, and they won't get to realize their equity. So when we look at the EV, we get a clearer picture that actually, while he does have the strong hands, he also has weaker hands, which really aren't going to win that often, aren't going to be allowed to win that often. and he has some marginal hands. In position, that's me in this case, I have some overpairs. I have the really strong hands down in this area, which are very, very high EV. It's also worth noting that position plays an important role in EV. If out of position has ace-4 suited, his EV is just under 16 big blinds. But if in position has it, his EV is 18.6 big blinds, because it's easier to realize equity in position. It's, you can decide when to bet. If he checks, you can always bet. Whereas when you're out of position, you don't know what the other guy's going to do. If you check, he might check behind. So that's how you evaluate range versus range. And so if we look at the overall strategy, you can see actually that my intuition was correct. There shouldn't really be much leading here at all from out of position. He should really be checking most of his range. If we look at the strategy, like there's no hand that actually wants to lead more than it checks. So I think really he should just check his entire range here. However, he did bet, so we do kind of have to deal with that. That's what actually happened. So we give the option. This is the size he used. And now let's see what my strategy should be. I fold 40%. So I fold all this stuff here that we talked about. The suited stuff that has very poor equity and EV. That just folds immediately because this is quite a large bet as well. Even stuff like ace jack and ace 10 has to fold as well. This unsuited stuff over here as well. And then I mostly call when I continue. I do a little bit of raising, but not too much. And actually, the only hand that raises, the only hands that raise more than they call are ace-4 suited and ace-6 suited. Most of my hands I just want to call. I sometimes raise with sets as well. Sometimes raise 5s, 3s, 2s, and my two pairs 5-3 suited. But you can see that my actual hand 6-4 just pure calls, and that makes sense. I think it makes even more sense multi-way, for the reasons I said earlier. So we do call, and the turn is the king of spades. Now again, we can look at the ranges, and you can see if we look at the equity of the ranges, out of position, in position almost have the same equity now. So the ranges have moved closer together, and that often happens when one player bets and the other player calls. The player who's betting will be betting, some hands as a bluff. The caller needs to have something to call. They're not just going to call with nothing. So typically their range strengthens more than the better. So you can see the ranges have come together in terms of the equity. Again, if we look at out of position, it's hard to, because he's not really supposed to do this. PO isn't putting in the bars here, but you can see he still has, he has some king X, which is improved now to a very strong hand, and he has his overpairs, which are still strong, and all the hands that were strong on the flop are still strong, but his other stuff is very, very weak now. And if we look at my range, you can see that my range, again, I have some king X that has improved. The same hands that were strong on the flop are pretty much still strong, except stuff like ace-5 suited has obviously gone way down in value, and my other 5x as well isn't really strong anymore. They've kind of turned into marginal hands. So if we look at my range now, we'll see some amount of green, a lot of yellow, and that kind of drives the spot. Because we have a lot of yellow, which is just trying to get to showdown as cheaply as possible, we're probably not going to be doing too much raising. Most of our hands I want to just call and get to the river as cheaply as possible. And given that that's the case, we can't really then start raising our stronger hands. Because if you raise your stronger hands and you just call with your less strong hands, then when you just call, he can overbet the river, and you're going to have to give up with your entire range. So let's see what that means for the strategy. Well, if we look at out of position again, as I said, he has a lot of hands which have improved. This is a decent card for him, so he can actually go ahead and bet, and he does bet a lot of the time. And he uses this size, 5.9 big blinds. That's a third of the pot roughly. He actually used a bigger size. He used this size, which again, it doesn't really make sense because he's betting into a sort of a range. Whether he bets 1/3 pot or 2/3 pot, I'm pretty much going to continue with the same hands. I'm going to give up with my weak hands, but I'm going to continue with all of my stronger hands. And even my marginal hands, you know, my ace fives, etc., are still going to continue to a 2/3 pot bet. So it makes more sense for him to go small. But again, he did go big. So now we have to see what I do with my king, my 6/4 suited. This was the first interesting point for me in the hand, to see if my friend's intuition that I should actually raise now and try and get the stacks in now was correct. And this is my strategy, because there's actually no raising. And this is because, again, if you think about his range versus my range, he has quite a polar range. He has some very, very strong hands, but he also has a lot of very weak hands. And raising into a polar range never makes a ton of sense, because the hands at the top are going to call irrespective of the fact that you've raised, and the hands at the bottom are all going to fold. So you kind of just narrow his range down to stuff that you're not in great shape against. Now, obviously with 6/4 suited, I have the nuts, so it doesn't really matter. But given that most of my range only wants to call, we can't just, again, raise the top of our range, because if we do that, then when we don't raise, we don't have the top of our range. So that's why the spot's working the way that it is. All of my king X wants to just call now. My stronger 5X, in fact, pretty much all my 5X wants to call as well, even to this size. Some of my 3X, I mean 4-3 suited, for example, is open-ended as well as having the 3. Ace-3 suited has a gut shot to go with it, although it does a bit of folding. Ace-2 suited is kind of a similar hand. It's a pair and a gut shot and an overcard. They're all calling. My overpairs are mostly hanging on too, although 8s starts to do a bit of folding. 7s pure folds. 6s mostly calls. And you might say, well, why is 6s calling and 7s is folding? Well, the reason is 6s has the gut shot. So it has that backup of the ability to make a very strong hand on the river. So I do just call. And then we get the 10 of diamonds on the river. And again, if we do the same thing, if we look back at how the ranges are doing now, out of position has a really polar range. Like, he has some hands which have almost no equity. You know, ace-8 suited, etc., 2% equity. But he has hands like kings that are 93%, eights 84%, ace-4 suited 95%, etc. He has some stuff in the middle, like 9s, 8s, 7s, these hands, even jacks and queens. They're strong but not super strong. My range, obviously 10s is the one hand that's really improved on the river. King 10 suited also has improved significantly. My hands that were strong on the turn are still for the most part strong. So I have sort of a lot of green hands, decent amount of yellow hands. They're the kind of hands we would like to show down without having to put too much more chips into the pot. And the red hands, which should either be turned into a bluff or just folded. So given this is the case, he's actually supposed to do a lot of betting now, because his range is quite polar. He has some very strong hands, and they want to bet themselves rather than risk me checking behind. And they use quite a big sizing. This is 75% of pot, and that's the predominant size being used. But he's also allowed to check some of the time. So that's what happens. He does check. And now, this is my response. As I suspected, if I raise, I should just go all in, because I'm polarized, remember. Again, if we look at my range in position, it's either green, it's either green or red. There's very, very little yellow, very, very marginal. So if I decide to so my yellow hands can just check behind, and just try and win at showdown, you know, 9s, 8s, 6s, those types of hands. My green hands want to get as much chips into the pot. They're very, very strong hands. So they want to go all in. And then some of my red hands will want to go all in as a bluff as well and try and maximize fold equity. So you can see that in the strategy. The hands that are calling are the marginal hands: queens, jacks, 9s, 8s, 6s, etc. Some weak king X. Well, most of the king X actually. The hands that I want to bet for value are sort of 2 pair plus king 5. And they can go big. And then I balance that out with some bluffs as well. I turn stuff like 4-3 into a bluff, for example. That's probably not going to win at showdown, but it blocks straights, and if I bet big, I'll get him to fold a lot. even pocket fours bluffs a lot of the time. So yeah, from a theoretical point of view, 6-4 suited, obviously the nuts still should go big. It makes sense to bet big with my range. Now, I still don't mind the fact that I didn't go big because I had a particular exploitative reason. I just thought he's always folding if I go big. Now, that being the case, if I got to the river with a bluff, I should obviously always shove if I think he's always folding. But when I have value, I wanted to try and get value or maybe induce a light check raise. So that's why I use the smaller size. So that's the breakdown of the hand, basically. The main takeaways are just to understand how PO works and how you set it up to get sort of meaningful output. But also, as you're going through it, don't just focus on your one hand. The one thing I didn't do here as we went through it is just go, okay, 6-4 suited calls on the flop, let's move on to the turn. Look at all of your hands, see what hands, if any, should be raising, what hands should be folding, and what your hands that should be continuing are. Similarly on the turn, don't just go, okay, 6-4 suited, it's a call, let's move on to the river. Look to see if you have any raises and try and work out what the reason for that is. The reason why that's much more useful is that will give you sort of general principles or heuristics that you can apply to other similar spots. And you'll sort of gradually get a better understanding of what good poker looks like. So that brings me to the end of the video. I hope this has been useful. If you leave comments for me, that would be very helpful, as I will be making other videos in this style. And tell me what you like, tell me what you didn't like, tell me what you'd like to see more of, and I'll take that into account in these other videos. As I said, the purpose of this series is to try and show you how professional players study.